Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to the poem of the day for today, Sunday, October the 26th, 2025. Thank you for joining me either again or for the first time. Much appreciate you watching and reading along or listening along. I especially appreciate it when people who follow along also chime in and give their reflections, thoughts, opinions, reactions to the poems, because certainly there's a lot that I miss. And I try to keep these brief-ish, so there's certainly much more to say than I typically get to in this time. If you've been following along lately, you'll know that we've been reading through some of the poems of Edgar Allan Poe, as it is October and nearing Halloween. This is the longest deep dive I personally, as a reader, have ever done into Poe, and it has taught me a few things about him as a writer, perhaps most of which is that I much prefer his prose to his poetry. I want to keep reading some of his poetry here for the next couple days, at least through the end of the month before switching gears. But today we're going to look at the second sonnet of his that we've done in this series. The first sonnet that we did was to science, and remember he had kind of a worry and attention about the way in which post-Enlightenment science was going to disenchant the world. He was very interested in the kind of supernatural or metaphysical elements that a lot of the Romantic writers were, and so he was very suspect and perhaps a little antagonistic towards the epistemological reliance upon an authority that science held. His other sonnet that we're going to do today is called Sonnet M Silence. And this is from 1839. So here's Sonnet Silence by Edgar Allan Poe. There are some qualities, some incorporate things that have a double life, which thus is made a type of that twin entity which springs from matter and light, evinced in solid and shade. There is a twofold silence, sea and shore, body and soul. One dwells in lonely places, newly with grass o'ergrown, some solemn graces. Some human memories and tearful lore render him terrorless, his name's no more. He is the corporate silence. Dread him not. No power hath he of evil in himself. But should some urgent fate, untimely lot, bring thee to meet his shadow, nameless elf that haunteth the lone regions where hath trod no foot of man, commend thyself to God. All right. First, I have to say that this struck me as a strange topic to approach through the sonnet form. When we talked about Shakespeare, we talked about the way in which sonnets were often love poems, not exclusively, but they were meant to sort of depict extreme devotional feelings, often of love, sometimes of obsession. But there was a certain kind of praise that typically went within sonnets. And so something that the English often, had the heroic verse running through the sonnets, right? And they would often also be used as a way to present a problem, complicate the problem, offer a solution to the problem, and then end with that final couplet. And the Shakespearean sonnet is the format that Poe takes with his poems. You'll notice here the rhyme scheme being A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G, right? And so that last couplet then taking on the Shakespearean rather than the Petrarchan form of sonnet. But again, what's interesting is that Poe kind of seems to steamroll that form in the sense that his couplet doesn't really offer either really a resolution or a summing up of the concerns of the sonnet in the way that Shakespeare's often did. So what I'm hearing in this poem is a identification or kind of a philosophical reflection on a dual nature towards silence. This was something that Poe wrote about in an earlier poem. I forget which one it was. I would have to flip back through and figure it out. But that difference between solitude and loneliness, between a silence that represents a kind of an abyss or a lack, versus a silence that's something that's more generative and peaceful. And so in this poem, he's ascribing that dual nature of silence both to physical aspects of nature, sea and shore, which is interesting to me because sea and shore, whenever I think of the seashore, I think of the sound of crashing waves, or at least of waves coming in, waves going out. I don't really think of silence. So what's interesting to me about that is that can be a very meditative sound. A lot of people will go to the beach in order to kind of get lost in their thought, but it's not silent so much as it's kind of a sound mantra, if you will. Um, almost like a white noise. Some people put noise on because they don't want absolute silence, but they don't want something that they have to be distracted by or engage with. And that's what I think of when I think of the sea and shore here, which he then equates through M dashes with body and soul. Sea and shore, body and soul. And I'm not sure how deliberate Poe was with equating those two things together, if he means to suggest that the sea is the body and the shore is the soul. I would think that it would kind of be the opposite, because I think of the shore as something that is stable, material, concrete, granular, whereas the sea is something that ebbs and flows. It's something that is shifting form, kind of amorphous. You can't really point to a beginning or an end of the sea. It fills out the containers in which it has. That's what water does. And I think that that's something that, at least in my understanding, would be more appropriate as a way to describe a soul. And then he says right after, one dwells in lonely places, newly with grass o'ergrown some solemn graces. But then we don't get to what the other one does, which I think is really interesting. Because he spends a lot of time throughout the rest of this poem telling us not to dread the corporate silence, and that's the silence of the body, which could be read, I think, and understood through the lens of Poe as a death, right? So the death of the body, which is not necessarily then the death of the soul, which is something that was kind of brought up at the end of The Raven, which we talked about yesterday. And it's a twin entity, he suggests in line 3, from matter and light evinced in solid and shade. So he's giving us several of these dichotomies, or these kind of binaries, as a way of describing the dual nature of silence. Matter and light. So again, something that's concrete, palpable, versus something that is visible, but not necessarily easy to contain. You can say that like a light is on, or you recognize light, but you can't touch, contain light. Light fades out. It doesn't have a distinct boundary necessarily, unless it's obscured by an obstacle, for example. And then again, he refers there as solid and shade, which I think is kind of interesting, because matter and solid seem to go together, but then light and shade are actually opposites. So the ethereal, or the less physical quality of silence that he's describing here, is also something that is being described as both of its polar opposites, as being light and being shade. And that's where he extrapolates on this to begin talking about it as a sort of death, right? Later at the end, commending thyself to God. Something that I think is also kind of interesting in the middle of the poem is he says his name's no more, right? Which of course means an annihilation, a death, something that once was but isn't there anymore. But of course we have to hear echoes to the Raven from yesterday, right? Nevermore, nothing more, Lenore, all of those things that are repeated through there. And he's telling us, not to dread the silence, because the silence, it seems as though the silence of our life is kind of a practice for the silence that's coming from death, that will come to us in death later. And so this poem in general, as a sonnet, even though it seems to be philosophical and descriptive, does in a way, an indirect way, and maybe an incomplete way, seem to somewhat be a bit of an ode to silence, a way in which Poe's trying to get us to demystify, not be afraid of silence that envelops us, because it's something that is innate in nature, within the sea and the shore, the solid and the shade, the matter and the light. But it's also something that seems to kind of practice the separation of the body from the soul that's going to happen near our death, at the time of our death. briefly, I wanted to bring another book into this conversation. You should see this desk. This desk is an absolute mess with all of these books here. But there's controlled chaos to it. Um, if you've been following along, I've been struggling a bit to remain positive about a lot of Poe's poetry because I don't intend for this channel to be a critique or a takedown, especially of great authors. To sit here and say they're not as good as one thinks they are, I think that would be frivolous and kind of pretentious. But I have been struggling to find as much depth and as much value for myself in his poetry that I have found in some of the others that we've read. But I got some help from this other book I was reading just kind of serendipitously last night. This is Charles Taylor's Cosmic Connections. The subtitle is Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment. And it's quite a girthy book, you'll notice, over 600 pages. And if you haven't read any Charles Taylor before, I strongly recommend it. He's a Canadian philosopher who I believe now is in his 90s. This book is maybe 2 years old. And he writes philosophically, but in a way that is so thought-provoking and reader-friendly. It's very well outlined. His sentences are clear and engaging and provocative. It doesn't have that dense academic language that can sometimes bog down some dense philosophical concepts. So he has, in my mind, mastered the ability to unfurl complex thoughts in pretty understandable language. And he has a chapter in here. It's like an 80-page chapter on Baudelaire, the French poet. And I want to read a couple of the things that he writes here near the end when he's talking about the legacy of Baudelaire and the way in which Baudelaire helped to transform the idea of symbols within poetry and what symbols were doing. So he writes, in this new understanding of the symbol, this is page 361, Baudelaire recognized a kindred spirit in Edgar Allan Poe. The American writer certainly shared his sense that the very perversity of evil exercises a great force of attraction on human beings. Skipping a bit. This is Baudelaire's words. By the unique genius, the unique temperament, which allowed him to paint and explain in an impeccable, arresting, and terrible fashion the exception in the moral order. And then skipping a bit again, Poe helped co-create the new understanding of symbol. And some of the evidence that Taylor gives comes from the description of the grounds in the house when the narrator arrives in The Fall of the House of Usher. That his description of neutral objects, things we typically thought of as neutral objects, were imbued with this sort of power of suggestion. And I think that that's something that we could discuss as having seen throughout a lot of the poems of Poe's that we've read. And so I just wanted to share that all with you because I think it's a nice assist from Professor Taylor here in finding, even if some of the poetry is not as beautiful or as inspiring as, for example, Wordsworth, Milton, Keats, those that I've read on this channel before, it helps us situate Poe within a larger context of the re-enchantment of the world through poetry, and to find within him kind of a kindred spirit in Baudelaire, who I think by all accounts is probably the superior poet. But to see that Poe was someone who was kind of an inspiration on Baudelaire as well, I think makes a strong statement for the importance of him as a thinker, even if his craft was not perhaps up to the same quality. But that's all for today. We'll have a little bit more Poe this week before shifting gears. And again, thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope you enjoy what remains of your weekend or your day if you're seeing this sometime later. And I wish you all peace.